to Rediscovering Gershwin, Insights from the Gershwin Critical Edition, which is a roundtable presentation and discussion sponsored by the University of Michigan's Gershwin Initiative. I am the managing editor of the Gershwin Initiative, and I am a University of Michigan alumni in musicology. The Gershwin Initiative itself is generously supported and created by the family of George Gershwin, the Leonore and Ira Gershwin Trusts, and the University of Michigan, and works in partnership with European American Music, the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, the Library of Congress, Schott International, and the Society for American Music. We have several great projects going on right now, including the Concerto in F and an American in Paris, of which we are having a concert this Friday by the University Symphony Orchestra that is providing a premiere test performance for us of an American in Paris, unabridged, and a Concerto in F. The members of the panel here are Mark Clague, who is an Associate Professor of Musicology and the Editor-in-Chief of the Gershwin Initiative. He is also the volume editor of An American in Paris. Kenneth Kiesler is an award-winning conductor of the University Symphony Orchestra, and at the age of 19, he actually conducted the first performance since 1925 of Gershwin's original jazz band score of Rhapsody in Blue. So we're very happy to have him on this project. Logan Skelton is the piano soloist for the Concerto in F. He is a much sought-after pianist and composer, and he's a professor of piano here at the University of Michigan. Tim Fries is a musicologist who is working at the College of Wooster. His main area of study is Austro-German music just before World War I, but he's the editor for Concerto in F, and that is a pursuit we'll talk about today. And finally, we have Kristen Clough. She is a grad student here at the University of Michigan in musicology. She is our director of online outreach and education, and she will be talking about George Gershwin's relationship to Paris. So let's welcome our panelists today. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. Can you guys hear me okay? Jessica already did the introduction, really appreciate that, but I just wanted to give my own thanks first to you for coming tonight, but also for our panelists for allowing me to rope them into this project. Tim Fries was probably actually the first person I brought on board because he was here as a student and did a project on Concerto. And so when this Gershwin Initiative sort of fell into our lap because Todd Gershwin, who's the great nephew of George and Ira, just gave us a call one day and asked if he'd be interested in doing this work. And we were smart enough to route him directly to the dean's office and because of his last name, and the rest is history, as they say. And then Kenneth Kiesler, who I think probably regrets having answered that email because he had one of the most wicked concert programs humanly possible to conduct on Friday, particularly as the first concert of the year. And the Adam Saxophone Concerto is terribly difficult for the musicians. And the American Paris isn't that easy either, really. Concerto in F, I don't know how hard that is, but what Ken will tell us. But I think it's turned out to be a real challenge for the orchestra. I'm really grateful to the musicians for taking this on right off the bat with a new term and short rehearsal time and knocking the rust off their embouchures and whatnot and really making this piece happen. So the commitment of the whole school is fantastic, and it's really something we can do here at Michigan, and why we were so interested in the project is because it brings together the synergy of a great performance program and a great scholarly program. So it's really this magic of both the art of research and the art of performance. Logan Skelton, my colleague, who, when the chance to do Concerto F came up, and I told him we would need to score in like 3 months. I asked a couple people, who are we going to get to do the piano part? And expecting, there's a lot of good pianists in this neighborhood, both on the faculty and among our students, and everybody just unanimously said, you got to ask Logan. He's great at Gershwin. His Concerto in F is his piece. And there was not a moment of controversy. He was the only person I was told to ask by everybody. And so I asked Logan, and he said yes. And I'm really thrilled to have Kristen here, who is studying with Jenny Fulcher, who's our expert in French music, and really looking at sort of the social impact of music. And I've asked her to come in and really sort of tell us a little bit more about the background of this piece. I'm hoping to learn a few things about George Gershwin's Paris. But I thought we'd sort of do this panel in concert order, talk about, we're going to have a mixture of John Adams' music and then George Gershwin's music, so the Chairman Dances, which is from sort of a foxtrot from the opera mixed in China. We'll open the concert, then we'll do Concerto F, then we do the Adams Saxophone Concerto, which was written for Tim McAllister. We could have easily had Tim McAllister on this panel, not only to talk about his piece, but to talk about the importance of the saxophone in George Gershwin, which is sort of emblematic, and one of the things that the critical edition really is doing is trying to restore the New York sound world of the 1920s to the orchestra, which was very much in George Gershwin's era, but maybe less so in, say, Stokowski's era at the time. So it's been one of the challenges, I think, of symphony orchestras taking on this music, is that it has such prominent saxophone parts. But our own Lisa Keene actually did some interviews online with Professor McAllister, so I gave him the night off to practice for his concerto, because I know he needs to practice a lot. But anyway, he's here in spirit, and certainly if you want to see his videos online, talking about the saxophone and Gershwin. But let's start with Mary Paris and Logan. Maybe since you're the soloist, you could kick us off.
Yes. I might mention just a couple of personal things having to do with George Gershwin and me. I grew up in a small town in Mississippi, and I did not come from a musical family, but my family did know Gershwin, and I did as a kid growing up. And it was the very first music that I had this personal connection to. And I remember I was about 12 years old, something like that. And I came running into my parents, and I told them, I was crying, and they said, what's wrong? And I said, this music, I know what he's saying. And it was actually American in Paris. Yeah, it was American in Paris. It was the first time I felt like I really understood a composer. And it was Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue was the very first piece I ever played with orchestra. I was a high school kid. And Gershwin Concerto in F is the piece I've played more than any other as a soloist with orchestra. It's been really interesting for me to work with this new edition. Do you remember some years back they took Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel and they cleaned it up, and it was shocking and colorful, and there's something of that. It's very odd for me to experience the piece in a new way, a piece that you know well, but you scrape away some of the traditions of performance that have kind of glommed onto the piece over however many years, and you take a real fresh look at it. So it's been very interesting for me. And another thing that's interesting is to go back to the original Gershwin recordings, which I've always listened to, but I just discovered this afternoon because of Tim, the fragmentary recording of Gershwin himself playing the concerto. And I can tell you one thing, he's sort of the Usain Bolt of piano players. He is really fast, and he's got a lot of energy. And he has his own distinct style, always, even though he's missing some notes. The talent is just crackling and popping all around him all the time. And because of the connection to my family, and my mother was the one who actually introduced me to Gershwin. She herself wasn't a musician. But every time I hear the big E major lyric theme in the middle of Rhapsody in Blue, or the two big lyric E major song themes in the Concerto in F, I always think of her. I just have this personal connection with the music always. That's basically what I have to say.
Well, I'm very interested to hear the beginnings of your relationship with Gershwin, because mine was similar. One of the few recordings we had when I was growing up was Rhapsody in Blue with Oscar Levant playing, I think. American in Paris on the other side of the recording. There was another one of Concerto in F. My father was a gym teacher and basketball coach. My mother was a geology professor in New York. So it's unusual that there were these worn recordings. I think it was probably about the popularity of Gershwin in that era with that generation. One of my earliest memories, I was telling Logan today, maybe 2.5 years old or 3 years old, sitting on my father's shoulders at an outdoor concert in Central Park in New York City. Walter Damrosch conducting the New York Philharmonic with Oscar Levant playing Rhapsody in Blue and Concerto in F on the same concert with an American in Paris. And there was a man in front of us who had his arms like this as he was watching, but he was playing the piano part, sort of the left hand over here and the right hand over there. And I was behind looking down and I thought, that guy really knows his music. I want to know this music as well as that someday. So that's how it started. And as some of you know, because I spoke a bit about it at the Gershwin concert when we welcomed the piano, Gershwin's piano. When I was 18, I thought nothing of picking up the telephone and calling Ira Gershwin on the phone and saying, you know, I have this recording in front of me that says original Rhapsody in Blue, but I've got the orchestra score, and it sounds like the orchestra score. Everything's the orchestra score. And there was some embarrassment. I also called the conductor and the pianist, and it turned out that they had said it was the original, but it was actually not the original jazz band version. And that led to a conversation with Ira Gershwin when I was 18, where he gave me permission to take this score from the Library of Congress. I hand-copied all the music out for the orchestra. And when I was 19, just after I turned 19, we did a performance. I was a sophomore in college when that happened. I had 3 different conversations with Ira Gershwin. But at that time, on that same concert, we did an American in Paris, and there were several changes from the score that I heard on recordings, especially the ones conducted by Paul Whiteman and Leonard Slatkin's father, Felix Slatkin. There were different orchestration. There was different orchestration here and there. So it says on the score, edited by F. Campbell Watson, Frank Campbell Watson. So I'm 18, and I figured out my best friend for research is the telephone. So I call directory assistants, and I find F. Campbell Watson, New York City. And can you imagine? I'm 18 years old, and this guy picks up the phone. What is going on? Who is this guy? I say, I don't understand. It says F. Campbell Watson on the score. That's you, right? He says, yes. I say, well, in the end, for example, it's the saxophones and the bass clarinet and bassoons have the melody. But on the recordings, it's the horn playing. What's the story with that? And then I ask, there are a few other things that are different from the score. He says, well, that's easy. And this tells you about the license or the liberty or the way people approached the music in those days. He said, well, you know how Toscanini lived in Carnegie Hall. His apartment was right next to the studio where we were recording. I think he said recording. Maybe he said rehearsing, but my memory recording. An American in Paris. And we were doing these spots over and over again, and Toscanini, he said, the old man. He said, you know, the old man stopped by. You know who I mean, right? He said, Toscanini. He said, okay. He said, the old man said, you know, you can't hear the saxophones. You should put it in the horn. So he said, we put it in the horn. And that's how it came. It came to be that the horns play instead of the saxophones, or in addition to the saxophones at the end of American in Paris. And there are traditions like that, as you say, have glommed on. And some of them are in the music. Some of these are not just conventions or now tradition, but written because F. Campbell Watson edited also Concerto in F, and he made certain decisions. And what Tim has done is he's removed some of those, so it's sort of cleaned up. So here's the problem as a performer. I think some of the things that F. Campbell Watson did were smart and musical and made sense. And we have this question then, because now we're taking the score back to Gershwin. Do we do what makes sense to us? Does it only make sense or appear to make sense because we know it that way, and we've heard it that way, we've done it that way for so long? And so that's the question every time we have to make a decision about what's different from the old, what I would call the old version. Now we have the new version. The new version being actually the original. So that's the challenge for us. And that's why it's great to be working with the editors on the pieces. One last thing, I was, after I did the original Rhapsody in Blue, I did the orchestra version shortly after. And I bought a set of parts from a store in New York City. And then I bought another set and another set. I had 3 sets of Rhapsody in Blue orchestra parts, meaning the parts are the music that the violinists and the horn players, the musicians use. And they had so many differences one from another. So I have this file of letters that I wrote to, I asked Ira Gershwin, how do I figure out what to do with this? And he said, write this guy at Harms or chapel music. Irving Brown. So I wrote Irving Brown a letter. And I have this file of letters back and forth, right? I actually listed all the differences between the parts for me. And Irving Brown eventually threw up his hands and said, I don't really know why there are differences. I didn't know we had 3 different publications of the orchestra version of Rhapsody in Blue. Apparently we do. I pointed out that the numbers at the bottom were a little different one from the other. He said, frankly, you're finding things about my company that I didn't even know. And that's this just gives you an idea of the state of the materials that we are working with and the importance of this initiative.
I wanted to use the few minutes that I have to speak to introduce how I came to be associated with the Concerto. I'll keep that mercifully brief because it doesn't quite compare in the color and interest to some of the previous anecdotes.
Ira Gershwin.
No, Ira Gershwin in this one. And then I wanted to spend the rest of the time, if it's okay, with Mark, kind of explaining how wide we were of the mark in our initial assessment that the Concerto F was going to be a straightforward addition. And this will then resonate very well with some of the points that Ken was making. I had only known Rhapsody in Blue growing up as a kid with a musical interest in band music primarily. I was a trombonist and liked marching band quite a bit. But as an orchestral trombonist in my undergraduate years, I had the great opportunity to play Concerto F. And it was among the most memorable of the musical experiences that I had from that time period. I remember being struck by the way it seemed to present a distinctive way of writing American concert music that I had not encountered before. And I remember very particular impressions from each of the movements. And that the first movement, I didn't realize that you could start a concerto that way, with just percussion, and then entrust them with one of the movement's most important motives. As a brass player, I naturally gravitated towards the bewitching beauty of the bluesy trumpet solo in the second movement, which combines this kind of languorous, long-tone, stepwise motion with these death-defying leaps that I was very fortunate not to have to play myself. And then I had never known how electrifying a repeated note could be until I heard what George Gershwin did with it in the final movement. My academic engagement with the score didn't take place until I actually came to Ann Arbor and was a doctoral student in historical musicology. I had the great fortune of being in Richard Crawford's Gershwin seminar. He's now on the board of the Gershwin Initiative. And for that seminar paper, I took the opportunity to revisit the Concerto, which I had so much enjoyed a few years earlier. I actually wrote the paper on Ferdi Grofet's arrangement for jazz band, for the Paul Whiteman Orchestra, and contemplated at the time trying to create an edition of that arrangement, which was not easy to come across. I was working at the time at MUSA, which is a series of critical editions housed here at the University of Michigan, and I thought this would be right up my alley to do an edition. The idea never went anywhere. However, you can imagine with what delight I witnessed the Gershwin Initiative slowly coming together over the course of a number of years after I left. And when Mark and I had our first conversation after it was clear that I would have the chance to edit the Concerto, we were agreed upon the notion that this was going to be a good volume to have at the beginning of the series because it's going to be relatively straightforward. We have, after all, a relatively robust set of sources going from sketches, initial sketches from Gershwin. We have his full sketch score in his hand, which is arrayed on basically 2 piano staves, usually one for the solo piano and one for the orchestra. We had a full holograph score, which was all of the orchestral parts written out in Gershwin's hand, very neat. One had the sense he thought of this as a statement. It was his first orchestral work that he had actually done the orchestration himself, and he was proving a point, even in his calligraphy, I think. We also have a few recordings of the work that are relevant. We have 3 with Gershwin at the piano himself, 2 abridged versions of the 3rd movement, and then the last 60 bars or so of the 2nd movement. And then there's one other score, the 2-piano score, which was a common practice to take an orchestral score and to reduce it for 2 pianos. And I'll talk about that one a little bit later. So it seemed like with all of this material, it's not going to have some of the problems that other Gershwin works have, where we have a paucity of materials. And so we thought this would be straightforward. And now that I've actually gotten this draft done, the words that more readily come to mind are puzzling, perplexing, bewildering, like hair-pulling, right, witness. And the reason is, I guess probably is true for any edition, that the challenges are unique and tied to the state of the source material. And any edition of Gershwin's Concerto is going to have to draw on 2 primary sources. And I'd just like to describe some of those and the kinds of issues that arise with them. The first source is Gershwin's own holograph full score. It seemed like it was going to be a great boon at first. I have all of the pitches and rhythms in Gershwin's hand. However, what I didn't realize until I started studying was the great variation in the determinacy of the score. That in some places we have it realized in exquisite detail down to the finest articulation and expressive marking and tempo indication. And then there will be stretches of just like barren, naked notes and rhythms with absolutely no modification whatsoever. And it raises the obvious problem: what do you fill in those gaps, and where do you get that information from? It also, I think, touches on a central tension, not only for this edition, but also for the George and Ira Gershwin critical edition at large, and that is that if you're trying to make a score that is authentically Gershwin, then you are. Let me back up and make another point first, potentially. I think when we say that Gershwin is bringing sensibilities of a Broadway and Tin Pan Alley composer to the concert hall, he wasn't only bringing popular jazz and blues styles, he was bringing a certain attitude towards the score. And that is that it's not a very precise, detailed blueprint for performance that should be followed slavishly in all details, but rather more of a flexible framework that has to be fleshed out with the artistic persona and contingencies of each individual performance. And so, when you come to do the critical edition, if you want to strip it down to just what Gershwin did, you are going to be recreating the unevenness of the score. It will be authentic Gershwin. Everything is attributable to him. However, will be then, as the George and Ira Gershwin critical edition, violating one of the other principles that is guiding this project, which is to render clean score pages that present a musically compelling and coherent articulation of the work that's accessible to younger orchestras. And so we're constantly being pulled in 2 directions, having to decide where do we strip away everything that's not authentically Gershwin, where do we add things back in, and if we add them back in, where do we get the information from? One of the other issues that arises with this holograph score is that it has all these markings from previous conductors and from Gershwin himself, pencil additions and changes. And on the one hand, it seems like this is a great find because we can use these to fill in some of these expressive gaps. The problem, and it's also important to realize that most of these marks were probably made with Gershwin in the room. playing the piano for the particular concert that the conductor was working on. The problem, however, is that the conductors themselves don't agree in many instances about how particular things are supposed to go. This is most easily illustrated with the issue of cuts. In the third movement, there is a red pencil that makes 4 cuts to the fourth movement. We'll call them cuts 1, 2, 3, and 4. Cuts 1 and 2 are negated by somebody with just a regular pencil. And then cut 3, it's actually amplified by that same regular pencil. It says, yes, you should have a cut here. And so we have a contradiction. These 2 hands were in agreement about cut number 3, but not cuts 1 and 2. We have then 3 different hands marking cut number 4, and nobody negating it whatsoever. Until we actually listen to the 2 recordings that survive of Gershwin, of a live radio broadcast of Gershwin performing this work, both of which have cuts, none of which align with cuts 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so it becomes kind of, you end up going down this rabbit hole and not necessarily knowing how you're going to find your feet again at the end of it. For those that are interested, the correct answer is cut 3 belongs, none of the others do, and I can tell you afterward why. I have to describe more sources to you to do that. The other source, the 2 piano score, is extremely important. Why is it necessary if you have a full score? Well, Gershwin's full score is an almost full score because he didn't actually notate the piano part in it. What he did instead was have his copyist take his sketch score, which represented the state of the composition 4 months before its premiere, and he had the copyist copy in that early state of the piano into his holograph score. And so it actually transmitted an earlier state of the work than the final state. Another problem is at that early state, the piano part's not complete. And so the only extant source of the piano part that is complete is the 2 piano score. Here's a copy of it right here. And it is an infuriatingly, it's an infuriating document for this reason. It is an alloy. It's not a tangle, it's an alloy, inextricable alloy of 3 different states of the concerto. One is that original early sketch score state. And so we can see all sorts of details that Gershwin revised when he came around to doing his holograph score. And so in that sense, those details are unreliable. However, we see all sorts of revisions that aren't in his full score that almost certainly had his sanction. And then we see a number of additions of expressive marks, tempos, dynamics, articulations, and whatnot that almost certainly don't have his authority behind them. And so I wish I were an alchemist who can somehow break this compound down and separate it into its distinct parts, which decisions are Gershwin's and which aren't. But unfortunately we can't. And I have to rely largely on circumstantial evidence to come to the conclusion that I think that very many of the expressive decisions and expressive markings in this 2 piano score are not attributable to Gershwin at all. I want to give one illustration of a complex issue that arises and where the 2 piano score plays a role. And it's simply, how are you supposed to connect the 3rd and 4th notes in the motive ba-da-dee-dee? When Gershwin sketched that motive in his sketch score, he has 1 slur, and he puts a tenuto over the long note at the end. When he orchestrates that line in his holograph manuscript, he changes it. He changes it to a single slur, but instead of a tenuto, he takes out the tenuto, he puts in a nested slur between the 3rd and the 4th notes. And the instruments that are playing here are 2 clarinets and a bass clarinet. They're all 3 playing together at the beginning of the 2nd movement. The nested slur is an ambiguous notational device. One gets the sense that Gershwin wants a kind of portamento effect here. It's very natural, but it raises this troubling question. Gershwin knew how to notate glissandos and portamentos. Why wasn't he doing that here? If you look at the Campbell-Watson edition of the score, you'll see that there is a slur for the top 2 clarinets, but the bottom clarinet, the bass clarinet, has a slur, and then instead of that nested slur, it has a grace note in there. And the question is, where did that grace note come from? We can attribute it potentially to Gershwin, but also to the two-piano score in the following way. The one surviving recorded excerpt of Gershwin playing the end of the second movement has this motive stated once, and it's not stated for clarinets. It's actually stated. Whoops. It's actually stated. He's going to give me the answer. Like, stop going on for so long. I got the answer right here. And so when Gershwin at the piano plays this motive, maybe we'll take advantage of Logan. He actually. Gershwin actually plays it with a grace note in the bottom voice only. Excellent, thank you. So you could hear that just the bottom voice, which is the orchestral reduction for the bass clarinet, actually has the grace note. The two-piano score reproduces that grace note all the way throughout the score, not just for that one instance of the motive being stated by the piano, but by every instance for the bass clarinet as well. Always. It's consistent all the way throughout. And if you look at Campbell-Watson's edition of the score, now it's no longer a reduction for piano. It's actually being played by a bass clarinet, and Campbell-Watson gave the grace note to the bass clarinet all the way throughout, but not for the upper notes. This creates then a tension because Gershwin actually notated the bass clarinet and the clarinets in the same way in every source that Gershwin wrote out. They should be connecting the third and fourth notes the same way, according to Gershwin. And so one of the puzzles is, what did Gershwin want the connection between those third and fourth notes to be, and how are we supposed to notate that? I won't totally get to the question of how are we supposed to notate that, but I think he did just want the portamento sound. And when he played it at the piano, at the end of the recording, he only added the grace note in the bottom voice, I think because that achieves the best imitation of a portamento at the piano. And maybe Logan can play then grace notes in all three voices, which is not quite as convincing. Those grace notes aren't notated in the score, he's having to improvise and add them. It's awkward for a pianist, and the effect is not nearly as close to a portamento. Yeah. And so one can imagine Gershwin having performed this at the piano with just a grace note added, that the preparers of the two-piano score heard him doing that, and so they add a grace note in that bottom voice all the way throughout, thereby creating this two levels where the clarinets and the bass clarinet are doing something differently all the way throughout, without that ever really having been Gershwin's intent. And so these are the kinds of complexities that come up in editing the Concerto in F. I'll simply close by saying that, giving you a sense of the big picture of how it's different from Campbell-Watson's score, I think it's scraping away these interpretational decisions that have been glommed on, to pick up on that phrase, and kind of created a kind of romantic bloat. The fortes and fortissimos in Gershwin's score have become fortissimos and fortissimos in the Campbell-Watson, largely on the authority of this two-piano score. A lot of the staccatos have been taken out and replaced and subsumed under legatos and slurs. A number of other changes have taken place. Adding accents is one of the big ones. Adding dramatic seguito pianos, and then so we can build up a second time and create even more tension. So this kind of exaggerated expression and romantic bloat, I would say, are two of the things that we've kind of peeled away. Now what's going to happen moving forward? If you go to the concert on Friday, you're going to actually hear the Concerto in F in a state that is more attributable to George Gershwin than any other performance, probably, of the Concerto in F in its entire performance history. And I think as we revise moving forward, what we're going to want to do is start to add back in some of these details that the initial conductors notated into his score that just seem musically indispensable at this point. And so, with that, I'll conclude my talk.
Sure. Actually, I think I have a microphone that'll work. Well, first of all, I just wanted to point out that the piano Logan is playing is actually George Gershwin's piano. It was donated to the University of Michigan by Mark Gershwin, who's George and Ira's nephew. And he, about the time we were negotiating a relationship between the university and the Gershwin family, he decided to move from New York to LA. And he was living in the same apartment that his mother, Rose, had lived in, and his father, Arthur, had lived in. There are 4 Gershwin siblings. You probably know about George and Ira. You probably don't know about Arthur and Frankie. George and Ira didn't have any children, so there are no heirs from George or Ira, no direct children. But both Francis Gershwin had 4 children, 3 daughters and a son. And Arthur Gershwin had 1 son, Mark. And then Mark had 3 sons. And there are so many people on the Frankie side, I can't even keep track of them. There are lots and lots of grandkids on that side. So we're dealing largely with the grandchildren of George and Ira's brother and sister. With one exception, which is the gentleman and his wife who will be here on Friday at the concert, he's 83 years old. He's actually Ira and Lee Gershwin's nephew, so Michael Strunsky. So George was hanging out with some good friends, the Paleys, and the wife of Paley, Emily Paley, was actually Emily Strunsky, and so they didn't ever think Ira was going to get married, so they sort of set Ira up with Emily's sister, Lee. Lee was reportedly madly in love with George, and she figured the closest she could get to George was to marry his brother. But George didn't seem that interested in her. I don't know if Beth will want to correct me on any of that, but that's the scuttlebutt among the family. And so anyway, but Ira lived quite a long life. He lived to 1983, whereas George died at age 38 in 1937. And so that's a lot of the reason why we have this work to do at all. If George had lived as long as Aaron Copland, we'd have some fabulous music that we don't have now. I find correspondence about his symphony he wanted to write, the second opera he wanted to undertake, and every time I read those letters, it just sort of looks like a dagger to the heart. Yeah, I think I'll write a symphony next. It's like, why didn't you get to it? So really, the symphony we have, in a sense, is American Paris. But because George died so young, and he died very suddenly with a brain tumor, he didn't have any time to, put his estate in order, didn't have time to put his scores in order. He was such a prolific workaholic that he have a pretty stunning catalog of music. But it's really not that big, it's just 6 orchestral works. But we are starting with the orchestral works because, as Tim explained, they're really easy. And they are easy, at least compared to the shows, because the shows all depended on how successful they were commercially. If they were really successful commercially, then they kept stuff. And if they were flops, they sort of said, well, we'll never use this garbage, and then they sort of threw it away, even though it was George and Ira Gershwin. So finding sources for that is going to be a nightmare. I did think I was being nice to Tim by asking him to do Concerto now. And I thought I was undertaking what I thought was a relatively clean piece. I mean, as the editor-in-chief, one of my jobs is to work with Jessica Gedman, who did the introduction, who was my partner, and to put together an editorial policy statement for the whole edition. And so one of the things I really wanted to do is get my fingers in the soil a little bit with this work, to sort of see what it was like, and so that I could talk to Tim with some knowledge, rather than just my sort of general principles of critical editing. Really, what does it feel like to edit George Gershwin? And the real challenge of editing George, is the tension that Tim brought out, is that he's composed at the piano, he composed as an improviser, he played all the time for parties, he was constantly working with new ideas and massaging things. And you're not really sure with any of George's work when it's really done, or what's the real state, what's the real work. And I think in a sense Concerto Enough maybe is less complicated than some. I mean, for Rhapsody in Blue, we're going to end up doing at least 3 and maybe 4 or 5 editions, because the original Jazz Band 1924 version sort of has one state at its premiere in February of 1924. It has another state by the end of 1924. It then has a version, which was actually a version that nobody knows these days, and it was the most popularly performed version during George's lifetime, because a lot of movie theaters had live orchestras, right? And so at intermission or before the show, they play Rhapsody in Blue. And this is sort of a flexible set of parts. You just sort of hand it out to whoever you have, and just make sure you have everything covered. If you don't have a bassoon, you give that to the trombone player or whatever, and you just covered it. And that was the most commonly performed version. And the symphony orchestra version, which is the most commonly one heard today, was actually sort of unusual, and at least in terms of the number of performances. American in Paris exists as the full orchestral score. This is our edited version here. It has a set of cuts, and there's also a two-piano version that's sort of done, and a single piano version that was published. That's actually the first score published is for single piano. And it doesn't have the same number of measures as this piece. So it's useful for a few things, but not as useful, I think, with your version. But what really sort of saved my work on this edition, because I'd had the composer's holograph and it looked relatively clean. It is true that sort of one of the things I'm pretty sure I said this in, is that the famous last words of critical editing is, oh, this one will be easy. But it never is, even when it looks simple, it's never easy. But the thing that really helped me was the fact that I came to appreciate the fact that this recording that George made in February of 1929, which was just a couple months after the December 1928 premiere, was a viable source. It's the complete work. George is supervising the recording session, and they spend almost 9 hours making a 17-minute recording. So I know it wasn't rushed. George handpicked the conductor himself, Nathaniel Shilkret, because he liked working with him in a previous recording of Rhapsody in Blue. He actually had considerable trouble working with Whiteman as a conductor, because Whiteman, I think, was really the first person who was trying to sort of fix George up, make the work more accessible, more popular. And coming from exactly the opposite side as Frank Campbell Watson, he was trying to make it a little bit more classical. Whiteman was trying to make it a little more popular. But this recording was enormously helpful at clarifying some ambiguities about articulation and lots of little details on instrumentation. They're pretty clear on this recording. And the most exciting thing that we've gotten a lot of attention for is the correction, as I would say now, of the taxi horn pitches. So the performance you'll hear on Friday will use the same pitches that are on this recording from 1929. Taxi horns are not a standard part of the orchestral percussion section. You not audition on taxi horns when you want to play for the New York Philharmonic. You audition on timpani and snare drum and xylophone and cymbals probably, but you don't audition on taxi horn. It's sort of a special instrument. And George himself had the only set of taxi horns that were available for use in this big piece. And one of the things that Tim brought this up is there's almost no barrier between George and the work. I mean, he wrote Concerto not for him to perform, and Rhapsody in Blue was for him to perform. And although Oscar Wilde and a few other people eventually, the pieces became so popular that George didn't have time to do them all. He earned a lot of money, not only for the work, but also for the performances. So Rhapsody in Blue was not commissioned. There was no fee like you would do today where you pay a composer to write with it. American in Paris was not commissioned. He did it because he wanted to. I think Concerto on F was commissioned. Was he actually paid a fee for that? Yeah, so Concerto on F is a little different. And in that sense, it might be a little more classical, really, than some of these other pieces. There is a relationship between the pieces, which is George offered the first performance of American in Paris to Walter Bamrush and commissioned Concerto on F out of gratitude for the commission of Concerto on F. Lots of people would have been happy to premiere this piece. But the recording, I think, turned out to be really the sort of Rosetta Stone, if you will, that unlocked a lot of the ambiguities in the score. So I've spent about 1 billion hours listening to this 1929 recording, and I've really come to love it. I mean, to me, it sounds fresh and exciting. It's a little bit more about, Usain Bolt kind of thing, very quick. He doesn't linger over things. It's not romanticized. It's not really swung very much. I mean, we tend to hear Gershwin now sort of through the scrim of Glenn Miller and Duke Ellington, the 1940s and 50s, in part when movies like American in Paris came out, and this music got recorded by Toscanini, and others, and it was on NBC Symphony of the Air, and I think many more people heard this music after George died than while he was alive. But we started to hear that in relationship to the jazz tradition. And although George was a jazz musician, he's as much a ragtime player, much a stride pianist, as much certainly a Tim Van Allen Broadway composer as anything else. So I think our own sense of who George is, and this is probably the sort of three insights I think from this piece that you'll hear. We wanted the taxihorns, so you'll hear instead of the way this came about is that George had these taxihorns. He bought 20 or more in Paris. And he had them on this hotel room while he was composing the piece. Because George, or Ira and Lee and Frankie were out sightseeing. George stayed in his apartment, much to everybody else's frustration, doing work. And so he went out to the automobile shops in Paris and bought all these horns. I think because he was looking for specific pitches. If he just wanted a sound effect, he would have just gotten 4. He wouldn't have needed 20. Figure out which ones were the ones he wanted to use. And he actually made several shopping trips. He didn't just go out once and get a few things and make it work. He went out, wasn't happy with the choices he had, went back to the auto shops, found more things. And my guess is that when he found the low A, he was happy. And that's the real surprise. Is there's this very high note and this very low note that you'll hear on Friday, which add much more range acoustically to the taxihorn's depiction of traffic in 1920s Paris. And one of the things about 1920s is that if you read some of the sources, these cars were going like 17 miles an hour, and people were scared to death because they were moving so fast. Right? People got injured on the streets because they couldn't get out of the way. Because the speed of life was accelerating in the 1920s with mechanical inventions. The trains were going faster, and everybody was really frightened with how quickly these, because they were used to carriages, right? And so taxis are dangerous. There's a real kind of anxiety over these sounds. And what George did is he had 4 horns, and he brought them back, and he had them affixed to a board, and he would take that to the premiere, and hand them to the percussionist and say, these are the horns, and you play them. And he wrote in his scores just the rhythms, and then over the rhythms he has the letters A, B, C, and D. And from the 1940s onwards, probably from Toscanini, who recorded it in exactly this way, they interpreted A, B, C, and D as the same as the letters on a piano keyboard, the same as the note names. And so they found horns, because George's has been lost after his death. They found horns that played A, B, C, and D, and they even marketed them as like, these are the real deal, right? And they weren't. They were just ones that were the only thing. They were doing the best they could. I think Campbell Watson made some brilliant decisions. And there are things I had to take out that I would have preferred to keep. But they're not George's, so I couldn't keep them. But anyway, so he says A, B, C, and D. But if they're just labels, if he puts a sticker on these 4 horns he buys and hands to the percussionist, says this is horn A, this is D, this is C, and this is D, play them whenever you see those labels. But the notes that come out of them are A flat, B flat, high D, and low A. So there's a whole, it's a tenth, of space rather than a fourth. So it's much wider. It's much more like random right? It's much more like that. And it's I think, way more interesting. And it's funny. The low A in particular, when it comes out, it's sort of jolting. It's a and so I think there's a little bit of humor, which of course is a characteristic of George's music generally, just to make it fun. And so that's an important part of the music that comes out with these new old pitches, rather than the ABCD version, which is not particularly compelling as far as an oral picture of the sounds of the street. And of course, people were fascinated with this stuff. There were other composers. Satie was putting guns and phones and typewriters and sirens and bells and music, and there are airplanes, colors, and all sorts of things that are being experimented with in music at this time to sort of bring the sounds of the real world into the concert hall. So in some ways, George was just following that same very modernist approach. And I think one of the things we find with these new editions, to take some of that romanticism away, is we find less the sappy Broadway balladeer and more the sort of 1920s lean, mean, mechanical, music of so the sort of roaring industrial age. And that, I think, is pretty exciting. The saxophones are another big thing. So the saxophones, and I think George knew that some performance of this would probably not have any saxophones and there'd be no taxophones. And you could play this piece without either of those, and it all works. Like you hear most of the notes, you hear the dissonances of the taxis, even without the actual horns. But when you have the actual horns, and when you have the saxophones, which he really hears in the streets, you know, of Arnold, right? He's taking the jazz front line of 3 reed players, and he's putting it in the orchestra. And he has a clarinet and a flute and an oboe, and the kinds of instruments that the Whiteman Band had really skilled musicians because they were the best paying gig in New York. They paid better than the New York Philharmonic. So when George was doing Rhapsody Blue, he had the best musicians in the time. And they also played pretty much anything you could want, everything from sopranina saxophone to hackaphone, right, which is a weird bass oboe that's sort of like half assumed. But anyway, he has 3 saxophones playing 8 different saxophones during the course of the piece. And in the 1940s, it's very clear that saxophone is not a standard part of the orchestra, and the musicians union requires doubling fees. So if you have musicians play more than one instrument, they get paid more. And so they simplify the parts, so you just have one guy playing alto, they're all probably guys at this point, one guy playing tenor, one guy playing baritone. And you don't have to pay anybody doubling fees. So you can afford to have the 3 extra musicians in the first place. They're sort of at the standard scale rather than getting bonus pay. So what we've done is we've put all 8 saxophones back in this piece. So you'll see the saxophones picking up different instruments. And probably the most stunning one is the return of the Charleston theme, which initially appears in the trumpet. But when it comes back the second time, is articulated by 3 soprano saxophones with bells in the air, just sort of wailing away. And it's a joyous noise. The other thing I think I've come to learn is I think a lot of the ways Gershwin's American in Paris has been discounted. Part of it is that George was so successful. He was so wealthy compared to like an Aaron Copland in his day, because his music was profitable in a way that regular classical compositions weren't. So I think there's a little jealousy. And I think there's also we look at George now as a kind of, prophet of American music, as one who realized that popular music and classical music could be brought together. But when he was doing the 1920s, it was a little bit more radical move, and something that people were pretty suspicious of. And so from the classical side, we've always seen in the critical literature a kind of, sort of discounting of George's artistic accomplishment because he sort of cheated. He used all the popular stuff. He wasn't good enough to write his own orchestrations. He wasn't good enough to... He's a melodist. He can paint a pretty picture. He's got a gimmick like the taxi horns. He's not a real serious composer like Rachmaninoff, right, or something like that. So, but as you get deeper into this piece, I think it is Rachmaninoff. I think it is Beethoven. I mean, there's all these series of walking themes, and it turns out they're all made of basically the same genetic material. The same rhythms, the same intervals make every single one of them. And you realize that the same kind of principle of organic development, of variation and development, is stuff that is exactly what George is working on. And you can analyze this piece as purely abstract with no story about an American going to Paris and getting drunk, getting homesick, hearing the blues, and going to the jazz club, starting to feel better, and then heading back out into the streets to enjoy Paris while he's there, which is basically the story of American Paris. But George was also interested in reaching a broad audience, not an audience of connoisseurs. And so the story of American Paris, is something that helps listeners sort of connect with George's music. And it brings out the melodies and some of the ideas and the form, but it almost covers up or hides the sophistication and the skill that George had in putting this piece together. And I think that's one of the things I've really come to appreciate, is that he's a good composer. And I've learned really to appreciate George through this piece. But we're going on a little verbosely, but let me let Kristen talk a little bit about sort of the world, the Paris of George Gershwin's Paris. And then we'll have a little bit of time for questions from the audience. So please think of a few questions or comments you want.
Well, I think what you were talking about with Gershwin's tension between popular and classical composition is really indicative of Gershwin's time in Paris. So when you're thinking about Gershwin in Paris and his relationships with French composers and how he takes on French style, it's really important to understand the cultural and political spheres in France he would have been encountering there. He visits France in 1923, 1926, and the longest visit to do American in Paris in 1928. And what you need to remember about the 1920s in Paris is that we're coming right out of World War I, and it has a tremendous impact on French society, not only culturally, but also politically. And while today, we kind of remember the 1920s as, in French they call it les années folles, in American we call it the roaring 20s, but this is in many ways mischaracterization of this decade in France, at least if you're looking at it from official cultural institutions. And so Gershwin in France would be straddling this institution cultural sanctioned divide and this avant-garde who were much more open to using popular musics. But the problem is, in France, politics and music have been entwined inextricably for centuries, and so much, the institutions, the venues where you get performed, the commissions, so many of these are tied to the state. And as we come out of World War II, the state is actually quite conservative, and this affects who Gershwin can have access to and who's going to be willing to work with Gershwin when he's in Paris. I'm going to kind of conflate for you the French composers he met in New York and the French composers he meets in France, because I think they both fall under a Franco-American exchange. But he approaches composers like Ravel and like Stravinsky for lessons because he really wants to learn more about his craft, and he gets turned down. He tried to go to the famous pedagogue and composition teacher in France, Nadia Boulanger, who also turned him down. He didn't approach Les Six, which is a group of 6 French composers who came of age during the war and just after the war. You probably are familiar with some of their names: Poulenc, Millot, Honiguer, Auric, Duret, Taillefer. I have to always count them or I'll miss somebody. Thank you. He also tried to study with Varese, and if you're familiar with the works of Varese, you'll understand why Varese said, "We're going in different directions. You don't want to work with me, kid." He also tried to study with Jacques Ibert, to study orchestration, especially during working on American in Paris. Ibert said, "There's no possible way I can teach you orchestration in the 2 months that you're going to be here in Paris, but I'll look at your scores." And so George is constantly reaching out. He also really loved Debussy, but missed the chance of meeting him since Debussy died in 1918. But when he was writing American in Paris, he also, during that trip in 1928, got a compilation of Debussy's scores. And I think Debussy's influence on Gershwin is really prevalent. One of the musicologists who writes on Gershwin, Pollock, has a beautiful biography if you're looking for a long read. It's really nice. He talks about the connection between the opening clarinet theme in Rhapsody in Blue and the opening flute theme in Afternoon of a Faun. And obviously one of them is significantly jazzier, but they're kind of coming from the same germ and the same seed. And so when Gershwin's talking about American in Paris, he calls it, in a typical French style, in the manner of Debussy and Les Six. And right away, many musicologists jump on this, because if you study French music, you know that Debussy and Les Six in the 1920s are not playing in the same ballpark. And so people say that Gershwin misunderstood French music and was extremely naive about the currents going on in France. But this is not true. He really closely looked at these scores and understood these musicians, and I think it was this Gershwin pulls from whatever he's got. It's the Broadway composer mentality. I've got Timpanelli, I've got jazz, I've got Debussy, I've got this awesome thing Mio is doing, and I'm going to use it all. And he can somehow find a balance between all of these disparate composers in his pieces. But also, to back up a step, to talk about maybe the more political ramifications. So I was talking about France's government in this time being largely conservative, and so this means many of the French institutions after the war are really devoted to ideas of nationalism and French nationalism, and they define French nationalism as the sense of the classic. It's balanced, it's proportionate, it's based in the Latin tradition. We're going to exclude all influences from countries other than France. since, I mean, they had just been fighting Germany, and they were worried about American infiltration of their culture. But this also includes excluding influences of parties within France, particularly French Jewish composers, who are some of the most famous and rich composers of the French tradition. But French composers at this time, like Vincent d'Indy, worked dedicatedly to exclude this music from French institutions and French canons. And so Gershwin, as a Jewish American, is going to be denied access to some of these institutions based on this and based on the prejudice of some French composers. And I'm sure I'm going to break a few hearts when I talk about Nadia Boulanger, who is an amazing composition teacher, worked with Copland, worked with Thompson, who also held these quite anti-Semitic views. And so I can't say why she turned Gershwin down. Ravel actually sent a letter with Gershwin recommending him to Boulanger, saying, this composer has amazing talent, and I think if I teach him, I run the risk of ruining it and just making him bad at what he does instead of the way he's naturally gifted. But maybe you're brave enough to take him on. And Boulanger turns him down, and it could be because she felt like she might ruin him too. Or it could be because Nadia Boulanger did work to actively exclude Jewish students from her classes and to keep the Jewish level lower. As a woman, Boulanger couldn't work in the official institutions, and so she had to do a lot of the filtering for herself. But this, I think, is in part what forced Gershwin into the corner with Les Six, with Milhaud, with Poulenc, whose influences we see so clearly, especially if you're familiar with Milhaud's ballets, La Création du Monde, or Le Neuf sur le Toit. He quotes Gershwin. In one of his works, he quotes Swanee, and so Gershwin and Milhaud just really take a very similar approach to composition, and I think it's Milhaud's ballets. I wonder if you compare, especially American in Paris being worked out in a single piano score, because that would be how a ballet would have been first worked out. Lost my train of thought. Yes, so Milhaud and also Poulenc, I believe in American in Paris, he directly steals one of Poulenc's bass lines. Yeah, so there's this interaction with the young avant-garde of France that I think, one, naturally fits Gershwin because he's a young composer, naturally fits Gershwin's style, and he picks up on it. He picks up on how they're taking popular music to work it into larger classical compositions. He picks up on, you were referencing Satie's Parade, where he has the pistols and the sirens, and all of these things that are pumping in 1920s Paris, and that are, I think, what we remember most about 1920s Paris. But there's also this story of necessity being the mother of invention, and these young composers had to look for alternative venues and alternative spaces to premiere this music, which I think makes it more permeable to Gershwin, because as you say, he's denied legitimacy a lot, and he probably would have been denied legitimacy on some of the main stages in France, but at the Théâtre Moderne, he was a smash hit. They loved his Rhapsody, though Ira in the diary has not nice things to say about the performance, but they still really enjoyed it. So I think the political situation in France can't be discounted when understanding a complex figure like Gershwin.
Okay. So just before we open this up to questions, let me ask Ken to comment a little bit on your experience with American in Paris, because I know you performed it before. And the thing that's special about Friday's performance, that'll make it the first performance of this particular edition, is that we have restored 104 bars of music that was cut from George's score. So it'll be several minutes longer than the American in Paris you know. There's one recording that has tried to integrate this, did a very bad job, but both in the editing, which was wrong, and also it looks like everybody's sight reading, so it doesn't sound right. But I just wondered, with things like the timpani roll or with the new music, what has your process been like in being so familiar with the previous version? Does it feel right to you know this new music in George's original approach, or does it feel awkward, or have you come to terms with some of these things?
It feels awkward. Let me direct.
That was the wrong answer, Ken.
I'm happy happy we're hearing the new music, and it sheds some light on his creative process and the history of the piece and so forth, but I think most of it kind of wanders around and is unnecessary, and it could be because I know the other way and like the other way, or it's just what I heard first and what I've done since I was a teenager. But on the other hand, maybe it's not for that reason. Sometimes we get the same material, it modulates, we do it again, it goes to another key, wanders around a little bit, then we find, the stuff that we're familiar with. I think I would choose not to do the unabridged version in the future, although you have to live through a performance, not just the rehearsals or several performances to really get the feel for anything. I want to say, last night I was, this program is very long. The conductor of the orchestra knew that it was a risk, that's me. I knew it was a risk to put so much music on the program. Two of the pieces turned out to be much longer than I thought they were going to be. The Sax Concerto is remarkably difficult. Especially, but not, it would be difficult for any orchestra, any conductor, and any soloist. But it's very demanding at the beginning of the year where we're just sort of getting our feet under us. So it's taken a lot of time. So we actually haven't, I'm just going to say this, today we hadn't played American in Paris in 10 days. Okay? We only rehearsed Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, so it was Monday. Yesterday I made a list of things to do today and put on there, check the pitches of the taxi horns. It's going to have them each played individually from the podium. It's really hard to hear the first two in particular and the fourth one in particular, but, and I was asking them for more and more and more. I understand you're Lisa in the back of the room, right?
Yes, hi.
So Lisa was at the rehearsal today. I had a lot of things to do, so I didn't have time. I skipped that note, checked the pitches for the taxi horns. I'm planning to do it tomorrow because we have to do this with different pitches, right? From the ones I have, and I have a set of horns that were sent to me by the Gershwins or Irving Brown or somebody when I was a teenager that are the wrong pitches, right? Or at least one of them. Anyway, so we played it today, and Lisa gave a note that those are the wrong pitches. So I'm glad we got that.
The first two were mixed up.
The first two were mixed up.
Yeah.
I see. Yeah. So, and those are the two that are the hardest to hear for some reason. I asked them, so they're mounted on a board, which means you can't take them off and raise them in the air and play them like that, which would make them more audible over the orchestra. So in the past, the old set that I had, I took them off the board, I put them on opposite sides of the stage, so you have the first one and the second one and the third and the fourth, so it sounds like traffic and they're coming from different places. This time I haven't done that because I thought we couldn't take them off the board, and the reason they come off, but the picture of Gershwin, we have a photograph of Gershwin with the four horns, and they're all mounted, and I assume that's the way they were played originally. So I find it's awkward, Now the thing about the timpani, there's a big timpani roll that we're all used to hearing near the end of the piece. That sound makes it sound much more like a Hollywood thing. Somehow it's more popularized or something. We're leaving it out. When we have a choice between doing something we've heard before and something that's different, we haven't heard, we're doing what we haven't heard before.
All right, questions? Beth?
Well, I wanted to give you some more ammunition on the taxi horns.
Mm-hmm.
There's a wonderful song, a Rodgers and Hart song from 1932, the song of Patty, which is in the movie Lovely Tonight. And the line is, they have taxi horns and claxons to scare the Anglo-Saxons. That's the song of Patty. So I'll write that down if you use it.
Yeah, that's great.
And that's Rodgers and Hart writing in 1932. The other question I have about Nadia Moshe, I agree with you that Gershwin was listening to Ulysses clearly. But what about Aaron Copland?
So I focus primarily on his interactions with French composers. I don't remember seeing in the... Yeah, Copland studied with Boulanger. Oh, yes, you're talking about, okay. So she obviously had to, I don't have a ton of information here. I'm mostly working off of what I have in Jane Fulcher's book, The Composer is Intellectual. And the impression I get when I was talking with Professor Fulcher yesterday is that you can't exclude everyone, especially in the institutions she was working in, and she must have chose to work with Copland over Gershwin, so it was probably one mitigating factor and not the main factor in her denial of Gershwin, but she did have some Jewish students, so it wasn't cut and dry, it wasn't black and white, as so many of these things in France were. Does that answer your question?
Well, I just would like to ask, did she work with Mio? Who's also Jewish?
Don't think she
No,
worked
I didn't think so, but
It'd be interesting to see about 60% of her students, because clearly, some of her students,
Yeah.
I would imagine they're more Jewish.
Oh yes, there certainly are, but especially, she didn't have 100% control, I think, over who was admitted, and I think she also wasn't dogmatic about it. I just more mentioned it since it's a touch point that I think a lot of people knew the name, and I think the history of the conservatism and the growing anti-Semitism in France is sometimes lost to the annals of history. So I don't want to hang my hat too hard on Boulanger and, say too much about her, but I kind of used it as more of a touch point example.
Other questions?
Hi, thanks for this. This is absolutely fascinating. What I wanted to ask was the idea of performance practice from that time. And how did that inform your decisions in editing this? How did that inform what you read in the sources with the people who worked with Gershwin and knew him? Obviously, an accent probably does something to a broadly different musician in the 20s that it does to a symphony musician today. How did you think about that, if you thought about that?
You want to comment on that? Influence your interpretation at all?
yeah, so you're absolutely right about what a mark is on the page is, it's only partially what the composer communicated, it's what's perceived by the person who's reading it. And people read it in different ways. Many years ago, I did American Paris with the New Jersey Symphony at the Statue of Liberty on the 200th anniversary of the Statue of Liberty, half French program, half American program. And we got to what you call the Charleston thing. And I said precisely, it's the Charleston. It's hustling and bustling and rhythmic and nervous and urban and mechanical. But they wanted to swing it like Glenn Miller style. That's a symphony, often a symphony musician who doesn't have experience in jazz, and many do, particularly brass and woodwind players, but the ones who don't, there's sort of a switch that they throw, which is we're playing straight or we're swinging, And this is not swung, and yet it's jazz influenced, and there are other ways of inflecting it. Some of it has to do with the rhythm. It's a tightrope walk. It's difficult to know when to do what's on the page and when to think the page is representing something else. A dotted rhythm, for example, in Concerto in F. Right? So today we play it and we have a classical bowing and the first violins play it sounds like Bach. Too quick, not laid back, not lazy. It's not like threes, it's not ba-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da, it's not that lazy, but it's somewhere in between. So those are some of the difficulties we're facing, and it's a matter of it's a matter of judgment. It's a judgment call.
I would just say one thing about the performance tradition and how it influences me. And that is, if you listen to Gershwin's recordings, and there are multiple recordings of the same piece, it's never the same. And there is no one version of a piece. And that is interesting, fascinating, how he varies things, what he does. And you can see the same person at work in the multiple versions of a piece. There is no one version. They're all by Gershwin. It also makes me think of a composer like Chopin, who composed his music, published it in France, published it in England, published it in Germany. He had his own score. He had students marked things in their score. Sometimes there are 6, 7, 8 different versions of the ending of a piece, all by Chopin. What are you supposed to do? The performance tradition like that, I find extremely inspiring, interesting, very alive. It makes me feel freer as a performer. And just exactly what Ken was saying about the swinging. I remember Balcom telling me when I first was doing some of his rags. No, it was actually Albright who told me this. He wrote a sliding scale from a 16th note, not an 8th and 16th note, to a triplet. And he said, the real players are in between. More this, they kind of lean this way, lean that way. Toward the end, they'll straighten it out. And he said, at first I was playing it like a white man. And that's what he told me, because I was doing that. Flip a switch and swing. But I became more able to sort of move around. I also wanted to make Tim say something. You said in passing to me, and I was amazed. How many changes did you have in the score? Something like 80,000?
Well, unique notational items. They're not changes, but unique notational items.
Oh.
So pitches, expressive markings, these kinds of things.
80,000?
Yeah. Yeah, and it was in 5 weeks that it was the bulk of it took place. I wanted to piggyback on some of the points that were being made here. I think for the performance practice issue, as editors, maybe Mark feels differently, but I think we're somewhat boxed in by the notation that is bequeathed to us. But I do have some control over the way this looks, even though the sources are in certain states. And for me, a revelatory moment was triangulating the few instances of Gershwin playing the piano for the Concerto in F, and triangulating that with what I'm seeing in the scores, and realizing how all of these fussy articulations that I'm finding in the 2 piano score are not in any way being realized by him, and how different his own 2 performances of the third movement, for instance, sound from one another in many instances. And so then this changes how I calibrate where I'm going to cut off. When does this articulation belong and when does it not belong? And I'm tossing out more as a result of this because I want to leave interpretational space as much as possible for performers today, and especially for performers coming out of an art music tradition where they might want to think, okay, if it's staccato, it must be staccato at all costs. I want to try to avoid creating a homogeneous reception history for the Concerto of F, moving forward.
No, I totally agree that George would have wanted performers to make it their own. I mean, I've taught a class on Gershwin here at school, and one of the things we did is go through a lot of the early Broadway shows. And so you'd have the singer who had premiered the part, like Gertrude Lawrence, who did K and OK. And she would be singing like the title tune or Someone to Watch Over Me or something. And I'd pass out the sheet music to students. We're going to analyze, really get into the details, put on the recording, and I just watch their faces because the music goes down and she goes up. And it's just, they're just totally different notes. I mean, she's singing a completely different piece. It's the same words, so most of the same rhythms, and she's, the first 4 measures were pretty much what was written on the page. But that was just part of the way people realized music. It was much more, we can do with what we feel and how it works. And George was, what really catapulted him to fame and got him the chance to do these classical commissions was accompanying classical singers, like Ava, the Canadian, I think she was a mezzo, Ava Gautier. And actually, while he was going, he had a very short time to write Rhapsody in Blue, but he ran off to do a recital in Boston with another singer. And he would go out and he would play the accompaniments to his own songs, to these people who sang Schubert. But the fact that he enlivened the accompaniments as a kind of improvisatory act just set the audience on fire. And that's what got Paul Whiteman to say, we should do that with my jazz orchestra. We should make a lady out of jazz by getting this composer who has these very high ambitions to write great music. And I really do think that's what George was after. He was after writing great music. It didn't matter to him if it was black or white or popular or classical or finale, or that just those categories didn't actually hold a whole lot of meaning for him. And I think that's really the insight I hope that our students get here at Michigan, is that we just sort of imagine that we have to fit in certain boxes and certain expectations. And you can also those can just not be there. Because they're really our own mental constructs, they're not facts. But I'm excited to hear Friday's concert and what we're going to do with it. So, we've got just a couple more minutes. Any other questions? Yes, Sarah.
So it was nice to read for the musicology panel.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the existing scholarship on Gershwin is very biographical. That's based in his life and how he can kind of view the music to that experience. And getting up close and personal with some of the pieces, just as kind of musical worlds of themselves. Do you see any new avenues of research opening up, or is it just kind of filling in a legacy?
I'll jump on that. I mean, I do think we're getting a new George is sort of coming out through the musical scores, and I think a lot of it is that we've been understanding Gershwin through the kind of aesthetic polarity of classical culture in a popular world, and that's been pushing our sense of who he is in a certain way. And the biographies, I think, also, although you're right, a lot of the stays there, they pretty much rehearse the same stories. They get a little bit more detailed. Some authors, and both of them graduates from the University of Michigan, Howard Pollack and Richard Crawford, are particularly masterful at weaving together that, and I think also bringing musical observations to inform their biographies. But one of the things that I've been doing, I mean, I think what Kristen was talking to about, the influence of specific composers, no one's really connected specific bass lines with whom. Right? So that's an area, people make that reference all the time. It's influenced by those things, but I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Well, I wasn't going to talk about that, but I was going to switch hats from Team France to Team Outreach. And I think that's what our project is making possible. So one of the things I do here at the initiative is I oversee a team of undergraduate students who are doing research in Gershwin. They populate our blog, and they're really proud of their work, and every time we have another hit, they're happy. So if you need some reading material, our blog is full of wonderful things. But one of the projects I oversee is by an undergraduate student, Frances Sabolnik, and she is doing this amazing research into literary correspondence and its relationship to operatic composition. So when you're a composer and you're having to work with your librettist long distance, and you can only correspond via written page, and your librettist doesn't read music, how do we talk about these sounds? And so I think until we had an edition of Porgy and Bess, until we opened up these avenues of research and created more resources than these biographies that are wonderful, I'm not sure we could get there yet, but I think that's what the critical edition is bringing. It's going to allow us to do some of this more detail-oriented musicological work, and I know they're undergraduates, but that's what I see my team of students doing day in and day out, and I think that's where the future of Gershwin musicology, I hope, lays, if I'm doing my job.
And that's what the Gershwin family wants too. I mean, they're very intentional about wanting this project to be at a university rather than being the project of a publishing house, which would be a normal place to stick the critical edition, be it Breithoff and Herald, or be it shot in Germany, not in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And the reason is because we get Kristen involved, and we get the undergraduate team that she's working with. We get the students that are working with Ken on the taxiderms, and they are going to go out into an orchestra, and particularly because we just had this big revelation about pitches. There's going to be right from here on out. And we just trained a group of 100 musicians about, I think, an approach to this piece which is refreshing and sparkles and is, in some ways, is less romantic, and in some ways is, I think, is more flexible. One of the things that was amazing about the recording is that there's several things that have been played for decades in that piece, with percussion lines in particular, that are just not there. I mean, they're just gone. And then you start to think about it musically, and you realize that 16 16th notes across a 4/4 bar with a blues melody and a trumpet that says molto rubato, it's very hard to get someone to play 16th notes on a snare drum in time with the trumpet that are going whatever they want to do. And it's going it's impossible to line up as a conductor. So what you have to say is, don't do that. Play it straight, because you've got to follow the percussionist. And when you hear George's recording, it's just the percussionist is not playing, and it gives the trumpet player a lot more freedom. And so it's those kinds of things that I actually think bring a little bit of personality and a little bit of style into the piece. It talks a little about your performance practice. Another thing that's on these recordings is all this portamento in the strings, where they're just sliding around. And some of that is written in, and 90% of it is not. Some of it has become part of the performance tradition of the piece, like the glissandes and the saxophone parts, which are also not written in. And what we've done in the edition is we've made a distinction between portamentos that are written by Gershwin, ones that have become so standard that people, the New York Philharmonic hasn't written in their parts. And we use those with dash lines, and we say, this is from the recording, it's part of the tradition, but it's not written by Gershwin. But he was in a performance where this was done, and it came out under his name. There are others that we say, for modern sensibility, if the violinists were doing every single portamento we heard, because sometimes it's just like a few of the violins, it's not the whole section, right? It just depends on who's playing. So, I think the other problem with doing it exactly the way it's done, if we could transport ourselves, or if George would call us on the phone or whatever, right, and tell us exactly how he wanted it, it's not necessarily the case that people would hear it the same way. Like portamento today would be very striking to an audience. They would sound sloppy or sound very expressive, whereas portamento in 1929 was like normal practice, right? So the way people experience the music also changed. So just like the swing issue, right? That hadn't been invented yet when George wrote it, right? The swing era had not happened, right? So we hear it back through that scrim of this history, but the people at the premiere didn't hear it in relationship to Glenn Miller, because Glenn Miller wasn't known. Right? So even if you could do it in exactly the same way, you still have to rely on interpreters to bring it to life for us today. And you have to give them, as editors, you have to give them the freedom and the authorization to do that. And what is really the key, I think, to critical edition is all the boring stuff right here. So these are all the critical notes where Tim and I confess where we change things. And that's the difference between our edition and the edition that Ken's been using for the last 40 years, 30 years, is that he doesn't know what's Campbell Watson and what's George Gershwin unless he calls Campbell Watson on the phone. And unfortunately, Frank is not with us any longer. And so that score, it just says revised after Campbell Watson, but you don't know what's George and what's Campbell Watson. Now you do. I mean, this tells you what's George and what's Mark Clague, and what I'm using from the recording and what I'm using from which source. And Ken is invited in his copious free time while he's rehearsing to change all of my decisions and just do whatever the heck he wants. But at least he knows what he's interpreting. That's the big difference. Any last comments from Ken?
It's very exciting.
Well, we hope we'll see you at the concert Friday night.